districts, such as contextual infill. What do you do about accessibility requirements? What about changes in use? What can you and can you not do in historic districts? We'll take a look at that. We'll also look at the Secretary of Interior standards and their relationship, how they discuss materials and setting and integrity, those kinds of issues as well. And then finally, we're going to talk about Senate Bill 1069, which is the state law that makes accessory dwelling units approved through a ministerial, meaning a staff review process. And we'll talk about that and how that may or may not affect historic districts. So just to get an idea of who's here today, can we have a show of hands? Who of you are from the city of San Diego? Okay, quite a few of you. How about commissioners or appointed representatives or elected representatives from San Diego? Anybody on the Historic Resources Board? Okay, great, thank you. How about professional planners, historic preservation staff? A few of you architects, other professionals in the design fields. Any other stakeholders from other professions? And what about concerned residents? How many of you are residents of historic districts? And you can, actually I should have said in the beginning, you can raise your hand a couple of times. You may do multiple things. So it's good to know. So some of this will be new to some of you. Some of this will be a refresher. And I hope you're going to enjoy this. A little bit about my background, why Diane. I've known Diane for about 40 years. I shouldn't really say that out loud. But she asked me to do this because I have experience on all sides of these issues. I was trained as an architect. I became a planning director. But more importantly for our discussion today, I served as the chair of the Design Commission for the city of Pasadena a number of times. And the Design Commission is also the Historic Preservation Commission for Pasadena Central District. So Old Pasadena, which is a large National Register district, is under the purview of the Design Commission. And I also was president several times of Bungalow Heaven. Has anyone ever heard of Bungalow Heaven? Bungalow Heaven is Pasadena's oldest and largest local landmark district in the late 90s, no, late 2000s. Wayne will probably know this. It was designated as a state and national, a portion of the state and national register district, so it has both jurisdiction. It's about 1,000 properties. I think it's the second largest residential historic district in California. I was president when Wayne Donaldson, who you'll hear from later, a terrific preservation architect and just an innovative, wonderful man. He was the state historic preservation officer at the time. My neighborhood, when I was president, my neighborhood was being designated, so it's an honor to have him here today. I'm also a resident of Pasadena, and I live in this historic district, and I just received a Historic Preservation Award from the city of Pasadena and recognition from the state of California for demodernizing my 1920 California bungalow. So I've been on all sides of the issue, and I'll bring that perspective. Okay? So any questions so far? How are we doing? Pretty good? All right, so I am mostly here, though, to keep you on track and also to learn. So this is going to be an interesting experience. And let's go ahead and we'll start with the first panel. Let me just move my notes here. All right, so this first panel, the main question here is how are historic districts identified and designated? So the panel will provide an overview and probably a refresher of some of you of the vocabulary of historic preservation designation. We'll hear from the city of San Diego, and what I've learned is that there are about 13 districts in the process of being designated now, and it's a part of a 6-year work plan. We'll also hear remotely from the planner from Pasadena. In Pasadena, we have over 25 designated local and state and national historic districts, and you'll hear about how Pasadena does that. So let's see, what else do I have here? The two cities are a bit different, and we'll see, how different ways of doing the designation process. So we'll take a break about 10:45, but our first speaker I'd like to introduce to you is Kelly Stan Coe. She is a senior planner in the Historic Preservation Planning section of the City of San Diego, and she's worked there for about 16 years. So she's presently involved in that 6-year work program to survey and then designate the 13 districts currently in San Diego. And I'll turn this over to Kelly. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to Balboa Park in our lovely Santa Fe room. I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about historic districts in the city of San Diego, how we process districts, a little bit about the history of our program, where we've been, where we are, where we're going. So just a bit of a refresher or a primer on some of the basics of historic districts. I'm not going to spend too long here, but understanding a historic district is a geographically defined concentration of resources, where the buildings collectively come together to convey significance under one or more designation criteria, whether that's national, state, local designation criteria. The individual buildings within a district may or may not be significant in their own right, but like pieces of a puzzle, these buildings come together to convey a significant story about the city's past. A district is the sum of its parts. It's comprised of both contributing resources that convey the significance of the district and non-contributing resources that do not. All properties within a district are typically regulated. Contributing resources, because they do convey the significance, are regulated more, and non-contributing resources less. Typically, when you're identifying a historic district, they'll be identified initially through a reconnaissance survey. A reconnaissance survey will provide a general context for the development of the area that you're looking at and the themes that are important to the development history of that area, and include a windshield survey that identifies concentrations of resources that may be eligible as historic districts, and the general distribution of buildings, and looks for ones that may be individually significant as well, but does not provide detailed parcel-specific information. The historic districts would then be verified through an intensive level survey. That survey identifies precisely and completely the location of all resources in the area and looks more closely at the historic district, providing detailed background research and thorough inspection and survey of all the properties to verify that that district is in fact eligible and which properties would contribute or not contribute to the district, and produces all the information that you would need to evaluate and list that district as historic. In terms of the components of a historic district nomination, you have a historic context statement that places the historical and architectural development of the district within a broader citywide, state, or national context. A statement of significance that evaluates the district under the designation criteria that you're looking at, again, whether that's national, state, or local. A period of significance that captures the period of time reflected in the statement of significance. A contiguous geographic boundary description and justification that must be based on a shared relationship amongst the properties as it's identified and evaluated in the historic context and the statement of significance, as well as a survey of each property, documented typically in Department of Park and Recreation forms, also known as DPR forms, and then classifying the resources within the district. Resources are those that were built inside the period of significance that you're looking at and convey why the district is significant. Non-contributing resources do not convey why the district is significant, either because they were built outside that period or they no longer retain sufficient integrity to that period to convey why the district is significant. Because contributing resources within a district are part of a larger whole and don't need to convey significance in their own right, modifications, either singular or cumulative, that may not be acceptable for an individually significant property may be acceptable on a contributing resource because the building is still able to convey the significance of the district. How properties are evaluated and classified may differ based on why the district is significant, if it's historically significant versus architecturally significant or significant from association with a person, and may also vary slightly from jurisdiction to jurisdiction in terms of how they apply their criteria and interpret the aspects of integrity. In the city of San Diego, Properties are typically classified as contributing or non-contributing as follows. Modifications that will likely not result in non-contributing status include things like non-historic window replacements in the original openings, enclosing a porch with glazing and leaving the framing and porch elements intact and evident, replacing historic stucco with a historically inappropriate stucco texture, going from something like a light sand finish to a Spanish lace finish, wouldn't necessarily make a property non-contributing. But modifications that may likely make a property non-contributing would include window replacements and altered openings, enclosing a porch completely with solid walls and losing all sense of that original porch form, replacing one siding type with another, going from stucco to wood or wood to aluminum, or significant cumulative modifications, kind of the death by 1,000 cuts. The building has lots of little modifications that come together or cumulatively impact the significance of the building and its integrity. So I want to delve a little bit deeper into the city's historic district program, talk to you a little bit about how our program is structured and the history of our districts in the city of San Diego. The designation of new historic districts in the city is regulated and guided by 3 primary documents: our Municipal Code, the board's historic district procedures, and our district nomination guidelines for volunteers who look to prepare historic district nominations. In terms of the Municipal Code, this document defines a historic district and establishes our designation criteria that we use. Those are included in the Land Development Manual of the Code. The Municipal Code allows anyone to submit a historic nomination, including a historic district nomination, so that doesn't have to come from the city or from a property owner. Anyone in the city can nominate a resource. It establishes the Historical Resources Board, as well as its composition and the powers and duties of the board, and provides the board with the authority to designate historic resources, both individual resources and historic districts. That authority rests with the Historical Resources Board. Many jurisdictions, it's a recommendation to an ultimate decision maker, but with the city of San Diego, the board actually has that authority. A designation can be appealed to the city council and may be overturned on the basis of errors in information presented to the board, violations of bylaws or hearing procedures, or new information that the board didn't have when it took action, but it's not a new hearing on the merits of the designation during the appeal process. Then we have the board's procedures for, or policy for designating historic districts. And that lays out the nomination requirements and the steps in the process for historic district designation. Once you have a complete nomination that has those elements we talked about before, the first step is reviewed by the Historical Resources Board's policy subcommittee. They'll review the context, the statement of significance, and the boundary for adequacy, and provide feedback back to staff on any adjustments that need to be made to that nomination. Once we get through policy subcommittee and they have a favorable recommendation on the nomination proceeding, we conduct a property owner workshop where we notify all property owners, we let them know about the district effort, what a district is, what the history and significance of their district is, and what it means to be in a historic district, both in terms of the new responsibilities that will come with that and the benefits that come with that as well. And we're available to answer questions to the property owners, both kind of in a broader discussion and then one-on-one if they want to come up afterwards and talk to us. We then have a property owner polling period. The property owner's consent and support is not required for designation in the city of San Diego, whether it's an individual resource or a district, but we are required to poll property owners to determine what the level of support is when we're processing a historic district. And we find that that's very useful because it demonstrates property owner engagement in the process. If you don't know whether property owners support the district or not, there's uncertainty about how engaged the property owners are in the process, how aware they are of it, and it creates some level of speculation as to what the level of support actually is, which, again, even though it's not required, can create pause and hesitation for folks. So it's good to poll the property owners to understand what their level of engagement is in the process. Then there are 2 hearings before the Historical Resources Board. At the first hearing, the board reviews the adequacy of the nomination and discusses the properties, begins to classify them as contributing or non-contributing. And then at the second hearing, the board finalizes that classification and takes action to designate the district. There's an appeal period of 10 business days following that board action, and if no appeal is filed with the City Council, then that designation becomes final. We also have district nomination guidelines that we have prepared. We had interest from members of the community in preparing and submitting their own nominations. We actually had 3 nominations that came from the community before these district nomination guidelines were developed. And so kind of through trial and error and through that process, we decided to develop guidelines to ensure kind of regular checking in throughout the process to make sure the nomination stays on track, and that the volunteers' time and energy and resources is well focused and spent. So the nomination guidelines do encourage the use of a consulting professional just to help guide them further, aside from the staff guidance, that they ideally would hire a consultant not to prepare the nomination, but to help advise them as they're preparing the nomination. There's 4 steps in terms of the applicant's process, and then the 5th and final step is the city's process. So in the first step, before doing anything, we ask the volunteer team to review all the applicable technical documents. So National Park Service guidelines on surveying and residential suburbs, our designation criteria and how they're applied, so that they can kind of familiarize themselves with those foundational elements of a nomination. In step 2, the applicant team must complete and submit a district nomination proposal. The purpose of that is to make staff aware of the district effort and to ensure that the district has been previously identified in a reconnaissance survey, to identify the applicant team, and ideally the qualified historic consultant, and to establish a course of action for the applicant through a draft methodology. And staff provides input and feedback on that before they proceed to step 3, which is development of the district-specific context statement, statement of significance, period of significance, boundary description, and justification. Staff reviews this, provides feedback. We have a meeting with the volunteer team to kind of go through and answer any questions. And once that document is in solid shape, then we'll docket it for review by the policy subcommittee to take a look at it. In step 4, we would be doing the survey work, where staff would provide guidance to applicants on how survey work would be conducted, and talking about those, the way integrity in a district is evaluated and how properties would generally be classified as contributing and non-contributing. The volunteer team would be preparing the survey forms for those properties and submitting that along with a spreadsheet to staff review. Once we have a complete nomination, staff would then take that district nomination from there through the process, through the steps that were outlined in the previous slide. I will say that these procedures have not been fully utilized. We've gotten to a certain point in this process with a couple of new volunteer nominations, but there is still an issue regarding staff availability to support this effort, which I'll talk about on a future slide. And they do require updating as well. We've changed our survey methods in terms of moving away from handwritten notes or Microsoft Word documents or Excel spreadsheets, and we're now doing our survey work directly in the California Historic Resources Inventory database, and I'll talk about that some more as well. So just a few thoughts about volunteer prepared historic district nominations. There's a lot of wonderful opportunities with volunteer-driven district nominations, and some challenges as well. The main, taking challenges first, a little out of order on my slide. The main challenges are really the availability of resources. Often the jurisdiction has not prepared and processed a historic district nomination directly is tied to limited resources, both in terms of staff, availability, and budget. And while a volunteer-driven district addresses the budgetary aspect, by providing the nomination, it can't address staffing availability to process the nomination. And that is the biggest challenge that we faced at the City of San Diego. And it's been extremely frustrating for both the volunteers, who I'm sure have felt neglected and unappreciated when staff isn't able to support that process, and staff who want to identify and protect new historic districts and encourage public participation in the process. But we do also have to maintain commitments to other aspects of the program as well. So that juggling act is still difficult. Lesser challenges include disagreements between staff and volunteers on aspects of the nomination when we're developing a historic context and statement of significance. There is a lot of pride of ownership in these nominations, which is wonderful. And so working with them sensitively to modify the nomination as needed. But more typically, the disagreements arise over classification of contributing and non-contributing resources. So this can often result in two different recommendations to the Historical Resources Board regarding how property should be classified. But I think the challenges are overweighed by the benefits. Obviously, we have a preparation of a historic district nomination at less cost to the jurisdiction. We do have that community sense of ownership of the district as a grassroots effort. We always like to encourage public involvement in local government and preservation and work collaboratively with the community on these efforts. So those are all positive aspects of the volunteer-driven efforts. So those are the regulations and policies and procedures that currently govern our program, but a lot has happened in the past 54 years of our program to get us here. The City of San Diego passed its first Historic Preservation Ordinance in 1965, 1 year prior to the National Historic Preservation Act. The historic preservation efforts began in San Diego in the early 1900s with restoration and heritage tourism marketing efforts in Old Town. In 1967, the city designated Balboa Park as its first historic resource and first historic district. There have been layers added to that designation over the years as it has expanded, and in 1977, it became a National Historic Landmark District. In 1969, Old Town State Park became a California landmark, and that was followed by local designation in 1970 and listing on the National Register in 1971. 6 other historic districts followed in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. The Theosophical Institute Historic District, located in Point Loma, on the current site of the Point Loma Nazarene College campus, was listed on the local register in 1976. El Pueblo Rivera, a residential historic complex designed by Rudolph Schindler in 1923, was listed on the local register in 1977. Located just steps from the ocean, the design of El Pueblo Rivera emphasized connection between the indoors and outdoors and foreshadowed the use of a building material, concrete, a construction process, slip form, and architectural details, including sliding doors and the use of modular grid that would be common in use 50 years later. The Gaslamp Quarter Historic District, one of our 3 most famous districts, probably next to Balboa Park and Old Town, is located in the heart of downtown and was listed on the local register in 1978 and the National Register in 1980. The Golden Hill Historic District, located south of Balboa Park between 24th and 25th Streets, was listed on the local register in 1984. The Chinese Asian Thematic Historic District was listed on the local register in 1987 and includes a 3-block area that partially overlaps with the Gaslamp Quarter. The buildings that are part of this Chinese Asian district are historically significant for their associations with San Diego's 19th and 20th century Chinese and broader Asian community. The Chinese community predominated in the district from 1860 to 1890, when they were replaced by large numbers of Japanese businesses. The Japanese community largely disappeared from the district in 1942 as a result of the U.S. government relocation program, and after the war, some of these businesses were replaced by Filipino tenants. The buildings within the district reflect unique ethnic adaptations of vernacular American architecture. The Sherman Heights Historic District, located south of the 94 freeway and east of the 5 freeway, was listed locally in 1987, and the Grant Hill Historic District, just east of Sherman Heights, was listed 1 year later in 1988. Following the designation of the Grant Hill District, there was a 10-year lull in the designation of new districts until the Bishop School Historic District in La Jolla was listed in 1998 for its association with architects Irving and Louis Gill and Carlton Winslow, and due to the Bishop School's significant educational, spiritual, and cultural contribution to the community of La Jolla and the city. In the late 1990s, we had a renewed interest in historic district designation that emerged following the city's following revisions to the City's Mills Act program that made that program more accessible to property owners. So in response to this interest, the city revised its historic district policy to include new types of districts, kind of our experimental phase with historic districts. So in addition to the standard geographically and thematically based districts, the city added 3 new types of historic districts, experimenting with different approaches to encourage historic preservation. In response to one district effort, in particular with a small but very vocal opposition, the city created a voluntary district type. that allowed property owners to opt in or opt out. And once 85% of the contributing properties opted in, a process to convert the property to a traditional geographic district was triggered. Ultimately, this failed as a district type. It's not generally a good approach to let property owners opt in or opt out, because if you don't have enough opt-in, you don't really have a historic district that's protected. And when the district was ultimately converted, that small but vocal opposition was still present. So we hadn't really gained much in those years where it was voluntary in nature. And we did actually lose one contributing resource during the time that was demolished. The city also created an emerging district type, which is actually somewhat similar to a multiple property listing format. Under this district typology, a context statement of significance and period of significance was developed, and properties that fell within those parameters and retained integrity could be designated as contributors to the district. In this case, it was also voluntary in nature. And our one emerging district is the Ocean Beach Cottage Historic District, where properties built between 1887 and 1931 that reflect the early beach cottage development in Ocean Beach could volunteer to have their properties designated as part of this district. Lastly, an archaeological district type was created to designate possible concentrations of archaeological resources across multiple parcels. This district type was never utilized. So revised the policy again in 2011, kind of streamlining it, learning our lessons from that period of experimentation, and bringing our district program more in line with state and national by providing a standard geographic district type. But during that period of experimentation, we did have a number of historic districts that were designated. The Auxiliary Naval Air Station Brownfield Historic District, located in Otay Mesa, was listed in 2000. The Tallmadge Gates Historic District, located in the Tallmadge community, is comprised of a series of wrought iron gates and decorative light standards that line the sidewalks in the community, and that was listed in 2000. The Shirley Place Historic District in North Park, it's a collection of small Spanish eclectic style bungalows, all designed by a single master builder, and was listed on the register in 2000. Actually, a recent reconnaissance survey identified a potential area of expansion for this district, which we will be processing next year. The Naval Training Center Historic District, located in Point Loma, was listed on the local register and the national register in 2000, and includes a diverse group of structures constructed between 1921 and 1943. The district is significant both historically and architecturally, and the buildings within the district display similar Spanish colonial revival and Pueblo revival design elements. The Ocean Beach District, as I mentioned, includes a collection of cottages built between 87 and 31 that reflect the early beach cottage development that characterized Ocean Beach. The Burlingame Historic District, located in North Park, east of Balboa Park, was the city's only voluntary district and was later converted to a historic district in geographic district in 2007, 6 years after its initial designation. And again, had much the same opposition it did when it was designated originally. The Island Air Historic District, located in City Heights, is a working class subdivision comprised of Spanish eclectic and minimal traditional style buildings, and that was listed in 2007. Mission Hills was the city's first volunteer prepared historic district nomination, which was listed in 2007, and it includes buildings kind of in the core of the original Mission Hills subdivision. The Fort Stockton Line Historic District, also located in Mission Hills, was the second volunteer nomination. It was prepared at the same time as Mission Hills, and those two were processed concurrently. The North Park Dryden Historic District, located at the northeastern section of Balboa Park, was prepared by a volunteer team that was led by the North Park Historical Society and was listed in 2011. The University Heights Water Tower and Pumping Station Historic District, which includes the iconic 1.2 million gallon University Heights Water Tower, is located in the North Park community and was listed for local and national registers in 2013. The Spalding Place Historic District is our new historic district and was listed on the local register in July of this year as part of our work program, which I'll talk briefly about. The district, which has a period of significance of 1909 to 1912, is significant for its development as a streetcar suburb, reflecting the real estate speculation and development of infrastructure that accelerated developments in the University Heights community, and for the influence of craftsman architecture on modest residential development in San Diego. This is a map of our historic districts in the city. Those folks don't realize how long the city of San Diego is. So we go from San Pasqual in the north all the way down to Otay Mesa and San Ysidro in the south, which makes a legible map challenging. So I've broken it up into a few slides. Most of our historic districts, as you can see, are kind of located south of the 8 in the areas around downtown Balboa Park and out to Ocean Beach and Point Loma. We have the Ocean Beach Cottage Emerging District, which covers the entire original Ocean Beach subdivision, but only those bungalows that have been volunteered and designated as part of the district are regulated. No other properties within that district are regulated. There's no non-contributing resources. We have NTC, Old Town. Here's our newest one, Spalding Place, comprised of 11 properties. Balboa Park, which we are sitting in right now. Gaslamp, Sherman Heights, Grant Hill, Burlingame, Island Air, out in City Heights is our working class, one of our working class historic districts. To the north, in La Jolla, you have El Pueblo Rivera and the Bishop School. And to the south, down in Otay Mesa, we have the Brownfield Historic District. So the city is currently in the middle of, or in the start rather, of a 6-year work program to process 13 new historic districts. These districts were identified in North Park and Golden Hill as part of the community plan updates for those areas. There were historic context statements and reconnaissance surveys that were prepared in support of those update efforts. And we are looking to implement the historic preservation policies of those plans to intensively survey and designate the potential historic districts that were identified in the Reconnaissance Survey. In doing so, we are utilizing a new survey process that utilizes the California Historic Resources Inventory Database, or CRID, and I'll talk a little bit about the methods for that. So just looking quickly at our work program, in the north, oops, got ahead of myself. In the North Park community, which is at the northeast corner of Balboa Park, the yellow are our designated districts out there: Burlingame, University Heights Water Tower, Shirley Ann Place, and Spalding Place. And we have new districts out there as well, including Pasadena, which has about 400 properties in it, Calmia Place, St. Louis Heights, Park Boulevard Apartment, which is characterized by some apartment buildings that were constructed to house visitors to the exposition. Oops. And then Via Vista Terrace, which should be processed hopefully by the end of November and designated. And then Wabash Mesa down here, which is actually a post-war subdivision. In North Park, there's one existing historic district, the Golden Hill District, and 2 additional districts that we are processing. The South Park District at the southeast corner of Balboa Park. We are expecting, hopefully, that to be processed and designated by the end of October, and that has about 406 resources in it. And then Caldwell and Taggart's here to the west of Golden Hill. In terms of our survey methods, we wanted to try and really maximize the potential of the CRID database and put all of our survey data directly into CRID. So to do that, we needed some new equipment. We got a handy dandy 2-in-1 tablet, which I'm using here today, and a Wi-Fi hotspot so that we could enter survey data about the properties directly into the database from the field. So we create the initial property record in the office that has basic information with the address, APN, legal description, estimated date of construction, and then we go out into the field and gather basic architectural description using the drop-down fields in CRID and take photos of the resource, which we can tie directly to the record. And then when we get back to the office, we kind of flesh out the architectural description, do any research into the construction history that we need to do, and finish those aspects of the survey forms. We can then generate DPR A and B forms as well as the district record as well. This is what that, oops, I'm sorry, I didn't advance the slide here. So that was our survey methods. This is what the drop-downs look like in CRID. There's the setting, the plan, the facade, how many stories, the style, roof form, materials, exterior cladding, the windows, and then an area where you can add an extra description. And this is what it looks like when it's completed and filled out. So we can use those drop downs and then do a narrative, brief narrative description of the resource and the extra description. This, again, I understand is not going to be legible, but just so you can see the types of DPR forms that the system can generate once you plug that information in. You can get your primary record and your building structure and object record for each property that has all the information that you would need to classify the property. In terms of the challenges and benefits of this approach, if you've used CRID before, you know the system can be buggy. So we've had to work through that, working with the vendor who hosts the database. We've worked through several issues that we've had to either customize or fix bugs in the system, but that's been a bit of a learning curve. Getting accustomed to in-field data entry, CRID was not intended for mobile devices. So picking the drop-down menus from very tiny menus can take some getting used to. And then use and access of the database does require some level of instruction. It's not a highly intuitive database, so working with folks who need to be able to access it to make sure they know how to get the information out of it that they want. Benefits, no formatting fights with Microsoft Word. I'm no longer struggling to keep the format in my DPR A or B form. Records can be created in CRID but held back from the public until they're finalized. We don't have to push them live until we're ready, so we can go in and continue to edit those. And then once they are pushed live, they can be instantly edited and made live again. So, you know, in the past when you're doing a survey form and you're using Microsoft Word or some other format, you prepare the form, you PDF it, you stick it to the website so people can see it. You have to make a correction, you have to go back into the original Word document, make the change, PDF it, repost it to the website. This we can all do instantly in the database as it's live. It provides all the district information in a publicly accessible location free of charge to the public so they can access it. It's paperless. These are actually the first districts that we have processed where we have not produced a large volume for each of our board members and members of the public, so it's all accessed online through CRID, which they may or may not like. I'm not sure if they're fans of paper or not. And it can be used by volunteers. We actually worked with CF Web Tools to create a specialized volunteer profile so that if we do have volunteers that are utilizing this database, they can go in and create a record, they can edit their own record, but they can't see or edit anything else that's in our database, and they can't push it live. The city has final review of, and approval for that record. So we can use the system for the volunteers as well. So they're not having the same struggles with formatting and so forth. So that concludes my presentation. It's an exciting time for historic districts. It's what I was brought on to do many years ago, and finally have the resources and the time to actually fully focus my attention on that. Boy, have I fully focused my attention on that over the past year. And we're very excited and very proud of our district program. So thank you very much.
Okay, it'll take me a second to get Kevin set up here, but while I'm doing that, I'll have Juliana introduce him.
Okay. Our next speaker is Kevin Johnson, who will come to you remotely. He is a senior planner with the City of Pasadena's Planning and Community Development Department in the Design and Historic Preservation Division. He's been a professional planner for over 18 years, in Pasadena for 12. I've had the pleasure of working with him as a citizen and also as a colleague. He manages actually the Mills Act program for the city, and I received a Mills Act grant. So if any of you want to talk to me about that privately or have questions, I can talk about that, address that as a private citizen. What Kevin did recently was to develop an app to make access to the historic preservation documents and create a little bit easier. So he did a smartphone app that he created and received a Governor's Historic Preservation Award and also a CPF Design Award. So he's been a terrific resource over the years. So what's sort of a benefit of the staff in Pasadena is that they can help when you're in the process of restoring a property. They have access to different resources, and they have terrific a library where you can look at potential when you're restoring potential products that you can use, and they're very good at helping you through the process. And I'm pretty grateful for that. I guess I can punt a little bit here. My house was built in about 1921. It's one of the newer properties in Bungalow Heaven. In the local district, this period of significance is about 1890 to 1929. And it's known for the largest intact collection of craftsman-era bungalows in the nation. But my house, somebody in the 1950s or 60s, we're not really sure when, decided they were going to modernize it. And what modernizing meant is that they took out all 22 windows and put in louvered jalousie windows. They covered the house in asbestos, but non-friable, thank goodness, asbestos siding. So it was buried under the siding for a good number of years. The kitchen was modernized to look, I think they really wanted a mid-century modern house, because the kitchen had a big kidney-shaped yellow tile kitchen. The bathrooms had plastic. We have 2 bathrooms that had plastic pink tile on the wall. It was pretty awful. We bought it as a foreclosure in the early 2000s. My husband always jokes that the gate came crashing down after we bought our house, so we could never buy it again. We could never afford to live in our neighborhood. So over the years, we went through the process of upgrading all of the utilities first, all of the plumbing, electricity. We had an oven too. We had all of the inside stuff that you don't really see, and redoing the floors and the ceilings and the walls. And then we replaced all of our windows. So this is when we started to work with the city, because we needed a certificate of appropriateness for anything that was visible from the public right-of-way, which was half of our windows. So we worked with the city, and we put in true divided light wood windows, and then eventually did the scary process of taking all that siding off. We didn't know what we were going to find underneath, and fortunately all that asbestos protected all the original redwood that was underneath, and it was a fairly easy job, and it was not inexpensive. It was an expensive job. There were some of the boards that had redwood shiplap siding, and all the aprons underneath the 22 windows and the corners had been removed to make it easier to put on the asbestos. So all of that was put back. In the process, we discovered the house had been extended. There had been a little porch on the side that had been enclosed in the 1930s, and underneath was all the vertical siding that was still there intact, all the redwood. So we left it like that so you could see what the house looked like originally, and how it was differentiated from the original part of the house. So it was a great process. Yes, there's a question.
Yeah, before Kevin gets started, does Pasadena still have owner consent requirements?
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, does Pasadena still have owner consent requirements? Yes, I think it does. For individually listed properties. Now, in the case of a neighborhood where the whole district is approved, and there are contributors and non-contributors, there has to be a majority of property owners that approve, and then everyone has to go along. So I think that's fairly much like you have in San Diego, kind of. If you can opt out. So in my neighborhood, where we don't have any individually listed houses, either on the local or the state and national register, once that was designated, everybody, even those who didn't want to sign the petition, their house is on the district, the local, and state and national register. But no individuals. For individually listing, I think you still need to have property owner consent, although it can be a volunteer that can nominate the property. So, are we ready for Kevin?
I think so, Kevin.
Okay.
Are you ready?
Kevin, are you there?
I'm here. Can everybody hear me?
Hi, Kevin.
Hi. Thanks for the introduction. I hope everyone can hear me okay. And just to clarify, actually, we don't require owner consent on individual designations, although the City Council has never designated a historic property over an owner's objection. They do have the right to do that if a resource is particularly threatened and they feel like it's necessary. So I'm just going to jump right into the presentation. Pasadena has been protecting historic resources since the mid-70s. We have about 400 or so individually designated historic resources that were both listing in the National Register or designated by the City Council. These are just some examples of buildings, structures, objects, and sites. So our historic designations run the gamut of all the different types of historic resources. Of course, we also have a number of historic districts, and as Kelly mentioned, links or resources within them may not be significant, but as a grouping or as a collection, they represent some important aspect of the city's history and can be designated as a landmark district. Our historic preservation ordinance governs how properties are designated and how they are reviewed once they are designated. Here you can see some of the purposes of historic preservation, of the historic preservation ordinance that we've established in our zoning code, including enhancing historically significant structures, fostering civic pride, implementing the general plan, fulfilling our responsibilities as a CLG and under CEQA and Section 106, as well as economic revitalization and adaptive reuse. The historic preservation ordinance includes designation of administrative authority and powers, general procedures, criteria for designation of individual historic resources and districts, as well as procedures for altering or demolishing historic resources. We also have a replacement building permit requirement, which actually extends beyond historic resources and says that you can't actually demolish a building in Pasadena unless you have a building permit for a new project to be built there. And that project has gone through whatever process is required for it. You can apply for relief from that requirement as well, and that's all outlined in the code. And we also have penalties for demolishing and altering without permits or certificate of appropriateness, and incentives for historic resources, all outlined in our code, which you can find on the web at cityofpasadena.net/zoning. This is a map that shows all of our designated National Register historic districts and landmark districts. The city designated landmark districts are in green, and the National Register districts are in purple. They range in size from 5 buildings to, like Juliana's neighborhood, over 1,000 properties. Bungalow Heaven, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but Bungalow Heaven is here, sort of in the northern central part of the city. The purple portion is the portion that Juliana mentioned that's listed in the National Register, with the green being the city designated portion. That was our first landmark district in 1989. And we now have 24 city designated landmark districts. We have one more that's about to become effective in just a few weeks, and I'll be talking about that district as an example of some of our procedures as they go into the presentation. That's the Rosevilla Oakdale Landmark District, which is immediately east of Caltech in the southern portion of the city. We also have 20 historic districts that are listed in the National Register, and we have 2 landmark districts that are pending designation right now, and a couple of others that are sort of in the works we're discussing with property owners in those neighborhoods. So in my presentation, I'm going to outline our criteria for designation of a landmark district that are in our zoning code. Explain how we identify eligible landmark districts, and then describe the process that we've established to become a landmark district. So there's 2 main criteria that are required to be designated as a landmark district. First is that the grouping represents a significant and distinguishable entity of citywide importance, and one or more of a defined historic, cultural development, or architectural context. And the one or more is important because as we go through and talking through this, you'll see that we've done studies of particular architectural or historical periods in the city's history, as well as particular types of historic resources. And those will identify districts that are coherently representing those particular contexts. but most of our neighborhoods in Pasadena are very mixed and represent multiple historic contexts. And Bungalow Heaven is the largest collection of craftsman architecture in the nation. It also has a number of buildings from the 1920s and 30s that represent our period revival era. And so it's important that we can designate landmark districts that are not representing a single context, but possibly multiple contexts. The second criterion is that within its boundaries, at least 60% of the properties must qualify as contributing. And we use the National Register bulletins determining contributing and non-contributing properties. And we use the same guidelines that Kelly mentioned. Non-contributing properties are either built outside of the period of significance of the district, or they have been altered significantly on the exterior so that they no longer convey their significance. There are some other findings that are required to establish a landmark district. A majority of the property owners, as Juliana mentioned, do have to indicate their support in writing. That's a minimum of 51% of the property owners. And so there is a significant effort on the part of the neighborhood, the landmark district proponents in a particular neighborhood, to get signatures of property owners to indicate their support. The designation of a landmark district also constitutes a zoning map amendment. It creates a zoning overlay over that particular neighborhood. And so a zoning map amendment has to be found to be in conformance with the general plan and to not be detrimental to the public health and welfare. So there's two main ways that we identify landmark districts in Pasadena. One is a historic context report and survey that is prepared by the city. And the other is sort of ad hoc review by staff upon request of property owners in a district to determine whether their neighborhood qualifies as a landmark district. And I'll go through some details on both of those processes. So in terms of city prepared surveys, in the early days of our historic preservation program in the 70s and 80s, we did a series of geographical based surveys where we would study particular neighborhoods and prepare descriptions of all the buildings within that neighborhood. They didn't necessarily identify landmark districts or eligible districts until a little, our program became a little more sophisticated as it went along. But we do have a lot of old documents that we can refer to that provide information about these neighborhoods and a lot of the characteristics of the houses and those that have been altered and those kinds of things. Also, we have 9 specific plan areas in the city, mostly in commercial areas, and each of those has a historic resources survey and context report that go along with those commercial districts as well, so we can draw from that information. More recently, we've conducted studies of architectural periods in the city's history, particularly in our residential neighborhoods. So here you can see that we've studied every period in the city's architectural history from the turn of the century to the mid-century modern era. And we have a historic context report for each of those periods, districts that represent those particular architectural periods very coherently, generally represent that singular context only. We've also conducted studies of particular types of historic resources that are important in Pasadena, and these are some examples of those. The bungalow court is a type of multifamily housing that is said to have originated in Pasadena. I don't know if we have definitive proof of that, but people like to say that. And it's a property type that we've studied extensively. We have about over 100 of these bungalow courts in Pasadena. Many of them are designated historic, listed in the National Register. We've studied them on several occasions. We've also conducted studies of early automobile-related properties. We have a lot of automobile-related properties from the early days when automobiles were first becoming popular. Pasadena had a very high concentration of automobiles per capita in the city compared to other cities. And so we have a lot of resources like the automobile showroom you see here in the top left or top right of the slide that represent that context. We've also studied historic design gardens. So here's one of our most significant gardens in the bottom left, designed by Florence Yock and the Sealed Council. We've also done a study of historic signs in the city, largely neon signs. So one example of one of these studies that we conducted is a study that we did in 2004 of residential period revival architecture and development in Pasadena with a period of significance from 1915 to 1942. We obtained a certified local government grant to conduct this study, and the result of that study was a historic context report and a historic resources survey. The historic context report provides a concise explanation of the significant architects that were active during that period and description of the significant architectural styles and their character-defining features. The Historic Resources Survey then took that information and identified 8 National Register eligible historic districts that represent this particular context very coherently, provided a list of specific properties in Pasadena that were designed by significant architects that were identified in the context report, and also to determine their potential significance. One of the 8 historic districts that was identified in that study was the what was then called the Nenita Parkway Rosevilla Historic District. Here you can see a couple of pages from that, that documentation, a map of the district, as well as some of the houses within it. These are some larger scale photographs of houses. The houses in this district generally represent colonial revival, Tudor revival, Spanish colonial revival, Italian Renaissance revival, architectural styles that were popular in the early 20th century between 1915 and World War II. So you can also see, going backwards, looking at the map, most of the properties are relatively large in scale. The houses are large as well, consistent with the size of the properties. So that becomes important as we start looking into the expansion of that district that we reviewed on an ad hoc basis. Moving into the ad hoc review, as I mentioned, the surveys and studies that we've done, they look at a particular period of the city's history and identify districts that coherently represent that particular context. But because our criteria for designation allows for creation of districts that represent more than one context, we occasionally have to look at neighborhoods that have a mix of historic contexts that are represented. And when property owners contact us, we will go out and take a look at their neighborhood and determine whether it appears that there are a significant number of contributing properties within their neighborhood to qualify, and what the potential boundaries would be for their landmark district if they decide to move forward with the designation. So these are usually neighborhood generated and very grassroots effort in Pasadena. Even the properties that we've identified in studies, we don't proactively go out and landmark any neighborhoods. We sort of wait for the neighborhood representatives to come to us to have their neighborhoods designated. So looking at, again, the Nenita Parkway Rosevilla Historic District, here you can see in yellow those original boundaries. One of the property owners to the east of this neighborhood, which is marked here in red, contacted us to find out if the easterly portion of this neighborhood would qualify to be part of the same district. So we went out and took a look at that neighborhood. As you can see, looking back at the map, the properties to the east are a little smaller than the ones to the west of Sierra Bonita Avenue. So they're smaller in character, but when you look at the photographs, you can see that there are a lot of similarities in the architectural character and in the period of significance. However, there was more of a mixture in this portion of the neighborhood. There were some additional craftsman era houses that were built in this area, so there's some that are a little bit older. So we took a look at this to determine whether, as a whole, the neighborhood would qualify, and we determined that it would. Our observations were that the houses in this potentially expanded area were, although in a smaller scale, they were of similar character and of the same period as the previously identified portion from the earlier study, and that even though it included earlier houses from the arts and crafts period, it would still meet our findings because we can designate districts that represent multiple contexts. So together, these two areas formed a cohesive neighborhood. The two streets at the eastern and western end of the appropriately terminate the landmark district on the eastern and western ends, and that there was a portion of the southern portion of the district that wouldn't be included because it was more coherently developed in the 1950s and 60s and would be eligible for designation separately. So this is the ultimate boundary that ended up being designated. The more mid-century portion is this area here that's sort of cut out of the district to the south, and that portion is eligible on its own to be designated if that neighborhood were to come forward and want to do that. And this landmark district becomes effective in just a few weeks, so it's gone through its entire process, and the neighborhood will be effective and become our newest landmark district. So moving on to the process that we've identified in our zoning code, the process first starts out with the property owners in the neighborhood consulting with city staff to determine whether their neighborhood is eligible. So whenever somebody comes to us, we first look at whether the neighborhood has already been identified in a previous study that we've conducted. And then if not, we would go out and take a look at the neighborhood, walk the neighborhood with the interested property owners, and determine whether it's eligible. If we determine that it's eligible, we would ask the people contacting us to identify a core group of people that would be supportive and would help prepare the application materials. We've had issues before where a single person has come to us and we've moved forward in the process, and then it sort of gets derailed because they didn't have enough of a core group. So now we expect there to be at least 5 or so people that are interested in pursuing that designation and going through the process before we'll continue moving forward. Then once we've identified that and we've identified the eligible boundaries, we will hold a neighborhood meeting to inform the property owners in that neighborhood about the effects of landmark district designation, and let them know that there will be people in their neighborhood coming around asking them to sign a petition, and just give them an opportunity to ask questions and become informed about what this designation would mean for them in terms of both regulations and incentives. So that sort of kicks off the application process for the neighborhood proponents, and they would then prepare and submit their formal application, which would include a very simple application form. We ask them to prepare photographs of all the buildings in the district and to give us a table of basic data, conducting permit research in the permit center about each of the properties, including when they were built, who the original owners, architects, and builders were, and any permits that are identified for alterations that have been done to those properties over time. So that helps us with our evaluation of the district as we move forward, and the survey work that we would do once the application is submitted. And then if they have any historical documentation of the neighborhood in terms of subdivision records, advertisements, historical photographs, those kinds of things, that they would compile that and submit that to us as well. We do not charge a fee for landmark districts or individual historic resource designations. Once we have the application in hand and we've gone through and conducted our survey, similar to what Kelly was mentioning, we do use the CRID database as well. We don't actually do our survey work directly in the CRID. We actually use a smartphone app developed by ESRI called Survey 123, so that we can record architectural descriptions with that smartphone app and then upload all of that data into the CRID in a single step. It's a little bit more user-friendly, and anybody can use it on their smartphone, so it makes it relatively simple for people to conduct that review. And we usually have volunteer interns that will help us with those surveys. So once we have the application in, we've conducted the survey, then there are 3 public hearings that are required. The first is before the Historic Preservation Commission, and they confirm the eligibility of the landmark district in terms of our historic resource guidelines and our historic preservation ordinance. The next is before the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission looks at the designation in terms of zoning, because it is a zoning map amendment, so they look at those findings I mentioned earlier for the zoning map amendment, as well as the petition signatures and verifying that those are adequate and meet our and represent a majority of the property owners in that district. And then the City Council makes the final decision on whether to designate the landmark district. Once they've made that final decision and those 3 public hearings have been held, then we prepare the zoning map amendment and ordinance, which is reviewed by the council at 2 subsequent meetings. We publish the ordinance in a local newspaper, and then it becomes effective 30 days after the publishing date. So when I mentioned the Rosevilla Oakdale Landmark District soon becoming effective, they have gone through all of this procedure. The ordinance has been published a couple of weeks ago, and so their district becomes effective in just a couple weeks. Once that's all taken place, then we upload all of the data to the CRID database, and all of that data is automatically revealed in our smartphone app, which is a more user-friendly and I guess entertaining way for people to identify historic resources near where they currently are. So using GPS technology of your smartphone, you can just ask the smartphone app what historic resources might be near your current location, and it'll give you a map and directions to those, as well as some basic information. It also has functionality where you can look up specific types of historic resources, like if you're interested in finding all the green and green design buildings in Pasadena, or if you're looking into another architect, you can look that up. You can look for a specific address to determine if it's historic. You can look up, different historic districts, and basically all the fields that you see here in the database. You can look in the smartphone app and then find those resources and navigate to them with the GPS. The third function that we have in the smartphone app is a series of walking and driving tours that we've developed for people to follow of different historic resources. So a lot of the studies that I mentioned earlier, we've developed walking and driving tours for people to find the important resources that were identified in those studies. And you can also sort of make your own tour by looking up different types of historic resources and then using the device to navigate to those properties. So that's a basic description of what we do in terms of historic districts in Pasadena, and I'll stick around to answer any questions that people have, but that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Oh, Kevin, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, yes.
Okay, great. You're breaking up a little.
I have lost.
You.
Oh, okay. I've lost the video feed, but I can hear you.
Okay. There was for going through the process of historic preservation. How does the city fund it? Bake sales? No.
How does the city fund, what exactly? I'm sorry, I missed a part of the question.
The historic preservation, the designation process, if there's no fee for an application, how does the city fund the process?
Well, our staff positions are funded by the city's general fund and our building fund. So we, the city staff is funded through the city's regular budget.
Okay, maybe you want to let us know. I know at one point, Pasadena, before 2008, there were about 30 staff members in the planning department. What's your division like these days? Uh-oh. We lost him.
We that's just a small division of the planning department overall. The planning department still has around 30 or 40 employees. So we're a small percentage of that.
Okay. Kevin, can you repeat that? Because we were losing you. Oh,
I'm sorry. So our division in Design and Historic Preservation has about 6 positions. And the overall planning division, which incorporates our division, the zoning administration division, and community planning, which is our long-range planning, has about 40 planners total.
Okay. Yes.
Okay, so just a reminder for everybody here, we should be asking these questions through the microphones because anybody who is on the other end can't hear us unless we use the microphone. So give me a chance to pass this microphone to you.
Okay.
I know it's an inconvenience, but I'm doing the best I can here.
Or else I can just repeat them.
Or repeat them,
yeah.
But it's usually quicker just to.
Okay.
Yeah, so next question, please.
You'd mentioned that your department sometimes does an ad hoc study, and when you do that, you generally don't reach out to residents, and I was wondering, is there resistance from a city state? I mean, does it create a weird situation when the city just organically reaches out to residents and say, hey, your neighborhood's a candidate for becoming an historic district?
For our ad hoc reviews, we wait till the neighborhood representatives come to us, and then once we have a core group and we know that there's a certain amount of people that are interested in the district, then we'll start reaching out to the greater neighborhood. Sometimes it moves forward and sometimes it doesn't. So there have been situations where there's a few people who are interested, and then once we have the neighborhood meeting, it becomes very clear that the rest of the neighborhood is not really interested, and so then the effort sort of dies and waits for a few years until maybe some of those property owners sell or something, and they might come back to us. So like when I first started here, there was an effort in a large neighborhood in Pasadena called Madison Heights. When we had our neighborhood meeting, it seemed very clear that people were not interested. But that has changed a lot, and today I think there is more interest in that neighborhood. So they're moving forward with an effort to try to designate a district there. So, things change with time. But yeah, there definitely have been some situations and some neighborhoods that I've gone out to that have been somewhat, hostile about landmark district designation. And so, we're just there to answer questions, and we just let them know, we're not forcing this on you. This is all coming from your neighborhood. If the majority of people don't want it, then we're not going to push it on you.
Hi, question for Kelly. The CRID software, is that something, we're from Palm Springs, and unbelievably, we don't have an historic district yet in our town except for one commercial area. And We are actually resident volunteers that are starting at the grassroots to designate a boundary area that could total up to somewhere between 400 and 500 mid-century homes that we want to protect, mainly from demolition. Is that software, is that available to, is that something that, we have a planning department of probably 5 people, and obviously they're not structured to specialize completely in historic districts. They've been extremely helpful, but they're limited. The software looks very interesting. I'm just kind of curious if you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, sure. The CRID database is hosted by a company called CF Web Tools. They host the CRID database for all the jurisdictions. So we have a contract with CF Web Tools to host and maintain and customize our database as needed. And I don't believe Palm Springs, as you mentioned, has that database. So typically those databases are, it's the jurisdiction that will enter into a contract with CF Web Tools to host that. If you were looking for something that the community could utilize to prepare survey data and then submit that to your jurisdiction, sounded like from Kevin that maybe that Survey 123 app is something that's more readily accessible to folks for that.
You might want to talk to Kevin about that.
We do have some questions from online, but are there any final ones from the room here?
Another question for Kelly about staffing. It sounded like you're the only one there doing preservation. Could you elaborate on the staffing?
So the Historic Preservation Program at the City of San Diego is jointly managed by 2 different departments. We have the sort of long-range planning, policy, ordinance, and survey work side of the program that's housed in the planning department, and then the implementation side involving designation of individual resources and project review impacting historic resources in the MILSAC program, and that's housed in our Development Services Department, which is our building department. The staff over in Development Services has kind of been ramping up their staffing. There's 2 senior planners and 3 associate planners, and then some additional staff in the planning department right now. Being general funded, I am currently the only full-time planner assigned to the long-range planning efforts and survey work. I do have another senior planner in the department, doesn't specialize in historic preservation by training. He's a long-range planner, but he's been working with me and has been.
I just wanted to clarify one issue. If a contributing structure in a district isn't volunteering to be designated or doesn't want to be a part of the district, is he left out as a non-contributing structure or what?
I don't think so. No.
It
depends on whether it's, okay, ask Kevin.
Sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Okay, Kevin, if there's a property owner that's in a district and does not want to be in the district, are they left out? Are they considered non-contributing, or are they contributing?
No, if their house is contributing and they're within the district boundary and the majority of the neighborhood has indicated support, we typically would not define them as non-contributing or cut them out of the district. There have been some circumstances, actually the district that I was focusing on, Rosevilla, Oakdale, there was one particular property owner who was at the very edge of the neighborhood boundary who was very opposed and very vocal, and the neighborhood felt comfortable just sort of redrawing the boundary to exclude that particular property owner's property, which could be added back in later, but they felt like that was a better approach than continuing to fight and have the negativity associated with that. So we've done that on the edges of districts, but if your property is like right in the middle, we wouldn't make it non-contributing just because the owner's opposed.
One other question for you. How many of your National Register districts predate the requirement for owner consent and for National Register designation? I'm sorry, it's been too long. I forgot the year that they introduced that.
Yeah, I don't know what year that was either. We have most of our National Register districts were designated before 2000, I would say. We've had a handful since then, yeah, so the vast majority of our National Register districts were designated earlier on in our historic preservation program.
Any other questions from the room here?
I'm just curious, from all the cities that are participating, have you seen a real estate value increase due to a neighborhood becoming a historic district? Again, we are kind of in step 3 of getting neighborhood buy-in for our district, and I think concerns is it will actually have a negative impact on real estate value or potential home sale.
I guess I could answer that a little bit. We did a study, and we had a panel at the CPF conference in Pasadena about gentrification. We've had some earlier with the American Planning Association. In our neighborhood, during the downturn, 2008, a lot of areas of the city did, there was a decline in certain areas, but not in our neighborhood. It stayed pretty solid, and then there's been a boom. Also, we looked at the properties around the boundaries of Bungalow Heaven, and the properties inside the district tend to be at least 10% higher in value than the ones around that. So there's a significant, and it's gotten so much publicity. I think Bungalow Heaven is going to be the poster child now for Stickley. So anytime that happens, it's been, there's been a lot of press about it, that the property values just keep going up and up. So we haven't seen a decline. I don't know, Kevin may know if there's a decline in other parts of the city, but I kind of can't imagine that.
Yeah, we've never done a comprehensive study, but I haven't seen any evidence that property values have decreased, and I think your assessment of Bungalow Heaven is correct throughout all of our other districts as well.
Okay, another question?
Add to that. Oh, okay, Kelly. In the city of San Diego, we've also seen generally increases, primarily, especially within residential districts where you don't have really more development than what's already out there. And there's actually been a couple of studies by an economics professor out of the University of San Diego.
That's wireless.
Yeah, you're good.
Economics professor by the name of Andrew Narwhal, who's done a couple of studies that have shown increases in property values, not only for designated properties, but for non-designated properties within certain distances of designated properties. And then anecdotally, I can tell you that we that. All right. So anecdotally, I can tell you that we often see properties that are listed for sale advertised as being designated or having Mills Act or being Mills Act eligible. We've even seen that on properties that are not designated, and we've had to call the real estate agents and say, you might want to be careful with that terminology because you're not designated, so you're not technically eligible for a Mills Act agreement yet. So,
and we have a lot of properties that are Bungalow Heaven adjacent that are in the listings. So.
My question is related to real estate also, just whether real estate agents, whether properties need to disclose the fact that they're in a district. Say you have a realtor from out of the area who may not be aware. Do sellers of properties have an obligation to disclose that? It's kind of a real estate, state law question. I don't know if anyone knows.
Well, we have a preeminent real estate historic preservation attorney here today, so she could probably tell you definitively, and maybe Kevin could. But I would say that you would disclose it. There's an overlay in Pasadena. There's actually an overlay zone showing that you're in the Bungalow Heaven, you know, that district, and that would need to be disclosed with the zoning. Am I right, Kevin, or no?
I'm not sure about the legal end of that, but I think it's always a good idea to disclose that kind of information because, as you know, we've had issues in the past where people bought properties in landmark districts and didn't know, and then they start doing alterations, and then it becomes a much bigger problem. So I don't think we've had that issue in recent years, but you know, about 12 years ago when I first started, it seemed to be something that was happening quite a bit. So we've reached out to real estate agents and done workshops frequently to encourage them to make sure that all of that is disclosed and that people know and that they do their research when they're selling a property so that people know all the regulations that would apply to it.
Yeah, so they know what they can and cannot do, what kind of changes they can make too. Also, I think with the Mills Act, it's recorded with your deed and it runs with the property, it doesn't run with the owner.
Right.
Yeah, so.
And another question, you mentioned sort of speaking about district boundaries. One issue that I'm curious about is period of significance. And can you explain, it seemed like you were a little more flexible in that one district, taking in a craftsman style house. Maybe that was not within the original era that you were targeting. Can you explain if there's other worthwhile properties within a geographical zone that's outside of your original period of significance? How do you handle that?
Well, basically, that would be a situation where the district is representing more than one historic context. And since our code and our findings for designation do allow for that, then you know, even though we did a targeted study of that particular period, we found that we would be able to incorporate properties that represent other historic contexts from other periods as part of the period of significance. So for the individual district, we extended the period of significance for that particular neighborhood to incorporate all of those earlier built structures. So we just identified whatever the earliest building was that was constructed, and that would become the start of the period of significance, and then the newest building that represented those contexts would then be the end of it. So so that finding that we can designate districts under more than one context allows us to establish a period of significance that's specific to that neighborhood, and that would incorporate all of the historic contexts that are represented within that neighborhood.
Okay, before we go to the next question, I'll bring the mic back to you in a second here. I wanted to very quickly address the questions that were done online. So Kevin and also Kelly, if this is for you. First question is the GPS app that lets you know what historic resources are near a city developed app, or is it the Esri Survey 123 or other?
The app that we developed was actually created by CF Web Tools, the company that created the CRID database. So it was sort of an extension of that database, and the city got a grant to hire them to do that work and create that app. So we sort of developed the vision for it, and CF Web Tools implemented it for us. The Survey 123 is a separate app that we use when we are recording architectural features of all of the buildings within a historic district, and that's the app that we use to collect that data and then upload that into the CRID database. So the Historic Pasadena app is not an app that we use for documentation. It's merely a more user-friendly way and you know, specific for smartphones and smart devices in terms of its formatting to obtain the data from that database and also incorporate the GPS functions of your phone to be able to find those resources out in real time.
Okay, and one more question before I take it to a person here in the room. Can Kevin elaborate on what a typical district ordinance looks like, and is this just identifying the boundaries, or is it more comprehensive?
The ordinance itself is pretty, it's pretty basic. It's just a zoning map amendment type ordinance. So it just sort of identifies the reasoning for the zoning map change and includes a map of the neighborhood and establishes the new zoning designation for that neighborhood. But before we create the ordinance, we do go through and develop a staff report that we present to the Historic Preservation Commission, Planning Commission, and City Council as it moves through the process. And that report is more detailed and identifies what's important about this district, what context or contexts it represents, and what how much support there is and how many contributing properties there are and all those details. So that doesn't get into the actual ordinance itself. The ordinance is just kind of a formality that establishes the new zoning designation for that neighborhood.
I have a question for you, Kevin, just since we have you here. Can you still hear me? Since we have you, and we're going to have later sessions. When Bungalow Heaven was first approved as a landmark district, it also came with a conservation plan.
Right.
Like what you can and cannot do, what you can change, and the type of review, what constitutes contributing, non-contributing. And subsequently, I believe that was codified as into chapter 17 of the Municipal Code. So do subsequent neighborhoods, when they want to be designated, do they have to have a specific conservation plan or specific rules for their neighborhood?
That's a good point. Thank you for bringing that up. So in the early days of our program, when we were first designating landmark districts, each district had to develop a conservation plan. And as Juliana mentioned, that was a document that would outline the, sorry, my phone's ringing. I don't know how to turn it off. It's a document that outlines the different types of projects that would require a certificate of appropriateness, either by reviewed by the commission or by staff, what types of projects don't require that, and just a general description of the district. Our first 3 landmark districts had conservation plans, and then as the idea became more popular, I think we realized that having a separate set of regulations for each district would become very cumbersome to manage. So at that point, we established a universal historic preservation ordinance that applies to all landmark districts in the city moving forward. That ordinance does specify that if a district already had a conservation plan, that conservation plan still governs. So we still have 3 districts that have slightly different regulations than the others that were designated after those. But the Municipal Code and the zoning ordinance establishes a consistent set of regulations for all landmark districts after those first 3 were designated.
Okay, so this may come up later. I wanted you to hear this from him.
Mm-hmm.
We have another question back there.
I had a question about your house that you bought in foreclosure. So at the time you purchased it, because of the asbestos and the windows, was it considered non-contributing? And then did it go back to contribute when you put in the correct windows and took off the siding?
It was considered contributing because none of the openings had been changed. And they considered the asbestos siding as like this temporary, it was removable. And it was indeed removable. So the character defining features of the house, it has porch columns, it has a set of windows with certain openings, it has a roof line, it has all those kinds of details were still intact. So it was enough for it to be contributing both on the local register and also on the state and national register. It just became more contributing. Okay.
I have a question for Evan. So Looking at the Nenita Parkway Rosevilla Historic District, that was a different example where the period of significance was cut off in the southern portion instead of extending the 1950s and 60s, it was cut off. Whereas in the previous example, the period of significance was extended to capture the 1915 built properties. Can you talk a little bit about some of the differences and nuances that factor into deciding either extending or cutting off a period of significance for historic districts?
Sure. So I think the reason that we, when we look at the district, if we take into consideration the mix of resources within that neighborhood and the mix of the different the contexts that are represented, and in the case of that particular historic district, the more mid-century properties that were represented to the south was itself its own cohesive district that didn't have any properties from any other periods of the city's history within it. So it made sense to us that that was a natural break in the history and development of that neighborhood that would warrant a separate district designation for that portion of the neighborhood. And because those types of resources were not mixed within the larger period revival and craftsman era district to the north. So it seemed like a clear break, and based on the National Park Service guidelines, the boundaries should really just encompass the historic resources that represent those contexts. So if it had been more of a mixed neighborhood, I think we could have extended it even further. We've certainly done that in other neighborhoods where there is more of a mix of buildings from the whole range of the city's history. But because this was such a distinctive and separate collection of that particular type of resource, we felt that it was more appropriate for that to be its own district.
Okay, a few more questions from online. Looks like we're pretty close to the completion of this, so I will limit this to 2 online questions, or maybe 1 depending on how long it takes, and maybe 1 more from the audience here if there is one. The question, first question is for Kelly. In areas where there are significant resources but not easily defined within a geographic boundary, for example, La Jolla, does San Diego have a thematic district process?
When we updated our district policy in 2011, we eliminated the thematic historic district type, as a lot of jurisdictions and agencies have, realizing that a historic district is more defined as a geographic concentration that really has a sense of place that can convey significance. So when you're looking at properties that are thematically related but not necessarily in sufficient concentration to be eligible for a district, you'd be looking at a multiple property listing format. And the city is looking to establish a procedure for that. Our current criteria, guidelines, and internal procedures aren't really set up for multiple property listings, so that's one of the things we want to look to do, is provide that framework so that we can establish multiple property listings and provide for easier listing of properties with shared themes and significance.
Great. I'm going to leave it for 1 more question from the room, if there is one, or comment.
Perhaps a lighter moment. Are most of the staff in Pasadena Planning Department familiar with the story when John Merritt threw Ernie Hahn's plans out the window?
Sorry, I didn't hear the last part of that.
I said, are most of the city planners in Pasadena familiar with the story when John Merritt threw out the plans that Ernie Hahn had submitted for the shopping center out the window?
Oh, no, I haven't heard that story.
Okay, and on that note, we will break for 10 minutes here. So you have 10 minutes to use the restroom or grab some food, and we'll be reconvened here at noon on the dot. 11.